Right, Psalm 118, let's call this one his brand, rejected. Understanding the famous passage, the stone that the builders rejected became the chief cornerstone. Comes from this passage. It's one that's quoted in the New Testament referring to Jesus. But in this psalm, there are three things that I think you will experience at some point in your walk with God if you stay with it for very long. And once again, this is a psalm that seems to be a bookend psalm, which means there is some theme that starts it off and closes it out. And this time, once again, it seems to be that theme of thanks to God for his steadfast love. The psalmist is going to open and close with that. And in between, the psalmist, who I believe is David, is going to say that one of the things he has had to get used to in his time or experience with God is being surrounded. So understanding that he had a protracted period of isolation when he fled from Saul, as we've talked about a number of times. Isolation was one of the things that David simply had to get used to before he finally turned the corner. God helped him turn the corner to find a group of people who were also isolated and dejected. And with that group of people, it seems that God had essentially built David's first army. As those who could identify with David came to him at the cave, I think it was the cave of Adullam, and God brought him out of that period in which he had experienced isolation, not just isolation, but being from time to time surrounded by enemies. These are things we've talked about before, but this psalm is a reminder because this is a passage that points forward to the Christ who likewise experienced isolation. And once again, not just isolation, the kind of isolation that left him surrounded, especially at the point at which he was abandoned going to the cross to suffer, for the most part, alone. So beyond that, there are times when God is going to take a person who is already surrounded or experiencing difficulty, and he's still going to discipline them anyway. And so that's the second thing David is going to talk about in this psalm. The fact that it might not have overlapped with his times of isolation. Understanding that God's not trying to torture him, he still recalls that God disciplined him, reminding us that there are no good guys in this story. And so if God is going to hold those who surround us accountable, he is also going to hold us accountable for the wrong things that we have done, a theme that we have seen throughout the Psalms. You see once again here in Psalm 118. And once again, it is not for superficial reasons that God disciplines those whom he loves. It's because in many ways, if we look at it as the price of admission to a great event, the price of admission to something as simple as a movie or a game, it comes at a certain cost. David is helping us understand that the price of admission to the places where God is trying to help us have a fit is righteousness. And so in some ways, the discipline seems to play a part in us being able to handle our part of the cost of admission. Understanding, we have many friends who would say that, oh, there's no cost that can be paid other than what Christ has done. That's fine. But the truth is, Christ, because he has paid the price, has the right to set the cost of admission. And if he says we have a part picking up our cross and following him, if we have a part to play in paying that cost of admission, then that's what it is. If we truly love God, we cannot go so far in our thanks and praise for his grace and mercy that we then dismiss the things that he has called us to do with regard to our own salvation. And make no mistake, David in this psalm is reminding us that there are some things that God is disciplining us for to make sure that we have access to the paths or the ways of righteousness that lead to a healthy relationship with him. Understanding, once again, as we mentioned, the third component of the relationship with God that David is describing in this psalm is rejection. And if the path that God laid out for his own son involved him being the stone that the builders rejected, understand once again, as we grow to maturity, three of the things that we can probably expect to experience maybe more than once will be, as David describes here, the experience of being surrounded by adversaries or those who do not have your best interest in mind. Likewise, quite possibly feeling overwhelmed at times at the discipline God will take us through in order to get us ready to fit in truly righteous places. And then finally, all that weren't enough, of his own son was described as the stone that the builders rejected, even though he was clearly overqualified for whatever role they would have had for him. Understand likewise that part of our maturing as we grow with God may not only involve being passed over for things for which we might be overqualified, but it might involve becoming familiar with the feeling of being passed over for things for which we were overqualified. Which is why we sometimes say God's best to you as you go forward in Him, not only understanding what it feels like to go through all three of these hardships, but quite possibly going through them so much that you are no longer frustrated by these hardships as much as the enemy becomes frustrated at your response to them.